At 36 years old, Calvin Hayes made $51,000 a year as an HVAC technician. It was an honest living, built on calloused hands and the satisfaction of bringing warmth to a cold house or cool air to a sweltering one. He drove a 10-year-old Ford Transit van with 147,000 miles on it, its sides scuffed but its engine meticulously maintained. He believed in taking care of things. His tools, his van, his family. He thought he had been doing a good job. He was wrong. The day after he buried his father, Calvin stood in the living room of the cramped two-bedroom apartment he shared with his wife, Charisse. The air was thick with the scent of wilting funeral lilies and the unspoken things that had been festering for years. Rain tapped against the window pane, a soft, mournful rhythm that matched the ache in his chest. His father, James, was gone. The man who had taught him how to hold a wrench, how to read a wiring diagram, and how to be a decent human being was now just a memory and a plot of earth in a North Philadelphia cemetery. Charisse stood by the door, her arms crossed. She was wearing a pair of $250 Lululemon leggings and a crisp white blouse, already shed of her black mourning dress from the day before. Her long, elegant braids were pulled back into a severe ponytail. She wasn't looking at him, but at a point just over his shoulder. "You need to leave, Calvin," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the sympathy he had clung to like a life raft for the past week. Calvin blinked. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning. "Leave? What are you talking about? Where would I go?" "I don't know. Your father's house, I guess," she said with a shrug. "It's empty now. You need to pack your things. I want you out by the end of the weekend." From the small kitchen, her mother, Odette, emerged. She held a steaming mug in her hands, a smug, satisfied look on her face. Odette had been a constant, oppressive presence for the past 5 years, ever since she'd moved into their spare room after her own husband passed. She never paid rent, but she offered a steady stream of criticism that she passed off as maternal advice. "Finally," Odette said, her voice a low, triumphant hum. She took a delicate sip from her $45 ember mug, a gift from Charisse. "Finally, my daughter can live right." The word "finally" struck Calvin with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a spontaneous comment. It was the uncorking of a long-held desire. He looked from his mother-in-law's gloating face to his wife's cold, impassive one. The devastating truth of his situation began to settle over him, heavy and suffocating. His father was gone. His wife was kicking him out. His home was no longer his. He was a man adrift, and they were the ones who had cut the rope. He had no idea this was only the beginning. He couldn't possibly imagine how deep their betrayal truly ran, or the cold, precise storm that was about to gather within him. What had he done to deserve this? He was about to find out it had nothing to do with what he'd done, and everything to do with what he now had. Before you hear about the cold fury that replaced Calvin's grief, let us know if you've ever witnessed a betrayal that left you speechless. Share your story in the comments, because sometimes knowing you're not alone is the first step toward finding your strength. Their life before his father's illness took its final turn had been a tapestry of domestic normalcy, woven with threads of financial tension. Calvin saw it as a life they were building. Charisse, he was beginning to understand, saw it as a prison she was waiting to escape. They lived in a third-floor walk-up in Olney, paying $1,350 a month for 85 square yards of space that felt smaller every day, especially with Odette occupying the second bedroom. Calvin's days started at 5:30 a.m. He'd quietly make coffee in their small galley kitchen, the $80 Mr. Coffee machine gurgling softly. He would pack a lunch for himself, usually leftovers, and one for their 7-year-old son, Micah. Micah's lunchbox was a bright blue Spider-Man one that cost $15 at Target, and Calvin always included a note drawn on a napkin, a smiley face, a little truck, a heart. He'd kiss Micah's sleeping head, the boy's twist soft against his lips, and then head out to his van. His work was demanding, especially during the brutal Philadelphia summers and freezing winters, but his paycheck, which came to about $3,200 a month after taxes, always cleared. It paid the rent, the utilities, the $450 monthly payment on Cheris's 2018 Honda Civic, and kept food on the table. It just never seemed to be enough. Cherise worked as a paralegal for a downtown law firm, earning a respectable $62,000 a year. Yet her salary seemed to vanish into a mist of small luxuries and unspoken wants. There was always a new serum from Sephora for $90, a subscription box for $60 a month, or takeout from expensive restaurants that cost $100 a meal because she was too tired to cook. "Did you see the new construction in Chestnut Hill?" she asked one evening, scrolling through Zillow on her $1,200 iPhone. Calvin was on the floor, tightening a loose leg on their second-hand IKEA coffee table, a piece they had bought for $50 on Facebook Marketplace. "Can't say I have," Calvin said, focused on the task. "This one is gorgeous," she said, turning the phone toward him. The screen showed a sprawling, modern Tudor-style house. 6 bedrooms, gourmet kitchen. They're asking $590,000. Calvin glanced at the picture. The house was beautiful, a world away from their cramped apartment with its peeling paint and view of a brick wall. "It's nice, Cherise. It's also $500,000. My point," she said, turning the phone back, "is that people are living like that. People we went to high school with. Tiffany just posted pictures from their trip to Italy. Her husband's in finance." "I'm in HVAC," Calvin said quietly. "It's a good trade." "It's a trade, Calvin. It's not a career," Odette chimed in from her armchair, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "My Cherise has a career. She has potential. She shouldn't be held back by a man who's content to play with furnaces." Calvin felt the familiar sting of her words. He finished tightening the screw and stood up, wiping his hands on his $30 work pants. "The furnace paid for that phone in your hand, Cherise, and it keeps this apartment warm, Odette." Cherise sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound. "Don't be so defensive. All I'm saying is, I want more for us. For Micah. Don't you?" "Of course I do," he said. But his more and her more were different things. His more was a small house with a yard for Micah to play in, maybe in a neighborhood like Mount Airy. A house he could afford, one he could fix up himself. Her more was a gleaming status symbol in Chestnut Hill, a life funded by a level of wealth he couldn't provide. The disparity showed up in small, constant ways. For their anniversary, he had saved up for months to buy her a $400 gold necklace with Micah's initial on it. She wore it for a day. Then it disappeared into her jewelry box. A week later, she came home with a $900 Tory Burch bag she'd bought herself. "It was on sale," she'd said, avoiding his eyes. "I deserved a little treat." His father, James, saw it all. During his Sunday visits, he would sit at their small dining table, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in the turbulent household. He'd watch Odette's thinly veiled insults and Cherise's discontented sighs. James lived in the same Germantown row home he'd bought for $20,000 in 1985. The house was modest, but it was paid for. On the ground floor was the 2-chair barber shop he had run for 40 years. A neighborhood institution. "She's got expensive tastes, son," James had said to him once, out on the sidewalk after a tense Sunday dinner. "She works hard," Calvin had defended, a reflex. James had just nodded, his gaze knowing. "There's working hard, and there's wanting what you haven't earned. Don't you ever forget the difference." Calvin didn't know then that his father was giving him more than just advice. He was giving him a warning. a warning that would soon become the cornerstone of his survival. The cruelty began the moment his father's doctor delivered the final, grim prognosis. James had 2 months, maybe 3. The lung cancer, a ghost from his youth, had returned with a vengeance. That very night, as Calvin sat stunned and hollowed out by grief, Cheris's focus was sharp and practical. "We need to talk about the house," she said. They were in their bedroom. Calvin was staring at the wall, the doctor's words echoing in his head. "What house?" he asked, his voice thick. "Your father's house, Calvin," she said, her tone edged with impatience. "He doesn't have a will, does he? You're his only child. That house will pass to you. And since we're married, it passes to me, too." He was disgusted by her timing, by the predatory gleam in her eye. "Can we not do this right now? My father is dying." "This is exactly when we need to do this," she insisted. "We have to be smart. That property in Germantown is probably worth $180,000, maybe more. It's our ticket out of this apartment. It's Micah's future." In the weeks that followed, as Calvin spent every spare moment at his father's bedside, Cherise's and Odette's conversations became a low, conspiratorial murmur in the background of his life. He'd come home late, exhausted from watching his father fade, and find them at the kitchen table, poring over papers. "The probate process can take forever," he overheard Odette saying one night. "And the taxes, they'll eat you alive if you're not careful." "I'm looking into it, Mama," Cherise had whispered back, quickly shuffling the documents into a folder as he entered the room. "Don't worry, I've got it handled." Calvin was too consumed by his impending loss to question her. He assumed she was trying to be helpful in her own pragmatic, unsentimental way. He had no idea he was witnessing the blueprint of his own betrayal. The day his father passed away, Calvin held his hand until it grew cold. He called Cherise, his voice breaking. "He's gone." "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she said, but her voice was distant, distracted. I'll start making some calls for the arrangements." For the next 4 days, Calvin moved through a fog. He met with the funeral director at the $15,000 service he was paying for with his father's small life insurance policy. He wrote the obituary. He picked out a simple pine casket that cost $2,000. He called relatives and his father's old friends. Through it all, Cherise was a blur of efficiency. She handled paperwork, fielded phone calls, and coordinated with the church. He was grateful, thinking she was shouldering the logistical burden so he could grieve. The day he was at the funeral home finalizing the details of the burial, a task that took 3 agonizing hours, Cherise was not with him. She had said she had a critical deadline at work. He later found out from a time-stamped receipt in her car that she had met her mother for lunch at a $150 a plate restaurant downtown. What he wouldn't know until later was what she did after lunch. At the funeral, Cherise stood beside him, a perfect picture of a grieving daughter-in-law. She held his arm, her head resting on his shoulder. Odette was on his other side, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. But Calvin felt a profound sense of isolation. Their comfort felt like a performance. His son, Micah, was the only source of genuine warmth. Kept safely with a cousin during the funeral itself, Micah had given him a drawing before he left. It was a picture of a little row house with a red and white striped barber pole out front. 2 figures stood in the doorway. One was small, with twists sticking up, and the other was taller. "That's Grandpa's house," Micah had explained, his small finger pointing. "And that's you, Daddy, your home." Calvin had folded the drawing carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, his heart aching. Micah saw the house as a home, a place of belonging for his father. Cherise and Odette saw it as an asset to be liquidated. The day after the burial, the performance ended. That was when Cherise stood in their living room and told him to leave. "But, This is my home, he stammered, the shock of it making him feel stupid. Micah will be fine, she said coolly. He'll stay here with me. We can work out visitation later. For now, I just need you to go. I need space. Space? He repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. You're kicking me out of my home the day after I buried my father, and you're calling it needing space? Odette stepped forward, her face a mask of contempt. She's been patient with you for years, Calvin, living in this shoebox, waiting for you to get your act together. Your father's passing is a tragedy, yes, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity for my daughter to finally have the life she deserves, without you holding her down. The words holding her down echoed in the silent room. He looked at Charisse, searching for any flicker of the woman he had married, the woman who had once laughed at his jokes and held his hand in the movies. He found nothing. Her face was a stranger's, her eyes hard and empty. Get your things, she repeated, her voice like ice. I'll have Micah stay with a friend this weekend so we don't have to do this in front of him. The mention of his son, used as a tool to manage her own convenience, was the final, devastating blow. He felt the grief for his father curdle into something else. A cold, hard knot of rage began to form in the pit of his stomach. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply turned, walked to the bedroom, and pulled a duffel bag from the top of the closet. He packed a few changes of clothes, his work uniforms, and his toiletries. As he zipped the bag, his hand brushed against the pocket of the suit jacket he'd worn to the funeral. He pulled out Micah's drawing, the little stick figure of him standing in the doorway of his father's house. You're home, Daddy. He looked at the drawing, then at the life he was being ejected from. A quiet, terrifying calm settled over him. He walked out of the bedroom, past Charisse and Odette, and didn't say a word. He closed the apartment door softly behind him, the click of the latch sounding like the final closing of a chapter. He had no idea that the next chapter was a war he was about to unknowingly win. The first few days at his father's house in Germantown were a blur of dust and sorrow. The air inside was stale, holding the faint, lingering scent of his father's Old Spice aftershave and the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago. It was a house frozen in time. A stack of National Geographic magazines from the 1990s sat on a side table. His father's reading glasses rested on an open Bible. For Calvin, it was a sanctuary of memory, each object a connection to the man he'd lost. He spent his time moving from room to room, touching things, trying to feel his father's presence. He ran his hand over the worn velvet of his father's favorite armchair. He stood in the small, tidy kitchen, remembering the Sunday breakfasts of scrambled eggs and sausage his dad would make for him as a boy. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He called Micah every night, his voice bright and steady, promising to see him soon. He told Charisse he was sorting things out and needed a little time, playing along with her narrative of him needing space. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning at 11:14 a.m. Calvin was sitting on the floor of his father's small bedroom, a cardboard box of old photographs open in his lap. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dancing dust motes. He was looking at a faded picture of his parents on their wedding day, his mother beautiful in her simple white dress, his father beaming with pride. His phone buzzed on the floor beside him. It was an unknown number with a 215 area code. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Is this Calvin Hayes?" a woman's voice asked, crisp and professional. "Yes, this is he." "Mr. Hayes, my name is Darlene Fincher. I'm a clerk with the Philadelphia Department of Records. I'm calling about a property at 5617 West Coulter Street." Calvin's heart gave a little jolt. It was the address of the house he was sitting in. "Yes? I'm here now. It was my father's house. He just passed away." "Yes? "Our condolences for your loss," she said, a rote but not unkind sentiment. "That's actually related to why I'm calling. We have a bit of a procedural flag here, and I was hoping you could clarify something. We received a quitclaim deed for this property, filed last week." Calvin sat up straighter. "A what? A quitclaim deed?" He knew what that was from his own cursory research years ago when he and Charisse had first talked about buying a house. It was a way to transfer property ownership. "Yes," Miss Fincher continued. "It transfers the property from the owner of record, a James C. Hayes, to a Charisse L. Hayes. The deed lists you, Calvin Hayes, as the heir and executor, signing on behalf of your deceased father's estate. It was filed on March 14th. Calvin's blood went cold. March 14th. He pulled out his phone's calendar. That was the day he had spent 3 hours at the funeral home, picking out his father's casket. That was the day Charisse had a critical deadline. "There must be some mistake," Calvin said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I haven't signed any such document." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, that's the other issue," Miss Fincher said, her voice now tinged with caution. "The reason it was flagged is because we just received a second filing this morning. It's a certified copy of your father's last will and testament, filed by the law firm of Morgan, Stern, and Associates. It was officially recorded with the county 6 weeks ago. That will places the property and all of your father's other assets into an irrevocable trust." Calvin felt like he'd been submerged in ice water. A will? An irrevocable trust? His father had never mentioned it. "The trust names you as the sole beneficiary and trustee," she explained, "which means any other attempt to transfer the property, especially one dated after the trust was established, is invalid. And frankly, the signature on the quitclaim deed, it doesn't look anything like the signature on the will. That's why I had to call you. Something is very wrong here." Calvin's breath hitched. Can I see this quitclaim deed?" "Of course. It's a public record. You can come down to our office in City Hall anytime." "I'm on my way," he said, and hung up the phone. The grief that had clouded his mind for weeks evaporated, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. He stood up, the old photographs scattering on the floor. He put on his $120 Carhartt jacket, grabbed his keys, and walked out of the house, his face set like stone. The rain had stopped. The sun was bright and unforgiving. He drove the 25 minutes from Germantown to Center City in a state of controlled fury. At the Department of Records, a sprawling bureaucratic maze of counters and clerks, he finally held a copy of the deed. It cost him $2. He stared at the single page. There it was, in black and white. The legal description of his father's property. The transfer from James C. Hayes to Charisse L. Hayes. And at the bottom, in the space for the executor's signature, was a clumsy, forged version of his own name. He could see the hesitation in the pen strokes, the slight tremor of a hand trying to imitate his fluid script. Beside the signature was a notary stamp. The notary's name was Patricia Beale. He didn't recognize the name. And then he saw the date, stamped clearly by the recorder's office, March 14th, 2:47 p.m. The time he was staring at caskets, his heart broken. She had been at a notary's office, stealing his inheritance. Stealing his son's drawing of home. The betrayal was so audacious, so monstrous, it was almost sublime. He folded the paper, his hands perfectly steady. The fog was gone. He knew exactly what he had to do. The shift inside Calvin was seismic. The warm, grieving husband was gone, replaced by a cold, methodical strategist. He understood now that he was not in a domestic dispute. He was the victim of a calculated crime. And he would respond not with emotion, but with evidence. The first rule of his new reality was simple. Charisse and Odette could not know that he knew. He went home to his father's house, the fraudulent deed tucked safely in an envelope. He called Charisse. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Hey," he said. "Just checking in." "Oh, hi." She sounded surprised, a little wary. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just, it's a lot, going through Dad's things." This was his first deliberate lie, the first brick in the wall of his new facade. "Listen, I'm sorry if I was difficult the other day. You were right. We both need some space to process." There was a relieved exhale on her end. "It's okay, Calvin. I get it. It's a stressful time for everyone." "I was thinking," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "maybe I could come by Saturday morning to pick up some more of my stuff. And I could take Micah to the park for a few hours, if that's okay." "Yes, of course," she said quickly. Too quickly. Keeping him away from the apartment, and from Micah, was part of her plan. Granting him a small, supervised visit made her seem reasonable. Saturday at 10 would be perfect. He was playing dumb, and she was buying it completely. The condescension in her voice was palpable. She thought he was a simple man, easily managed, overcome with grief, and a little bit stupid. She had made a critical mistake. That Saturday, he arrived at the apartment at exactly 10 a.m. Charisse opened the door, a strained smile on her face. Odette was hovering in the background, watching him like a hawk. "How are you holding up?" Charisse asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Getting by," he said, walking past her. He had a couple of empty boxes with him. He went to the bedroom and began to pack things he didn't care about. Old paperbacks, clothes he never wore, a broken lamp. It was all for show. "So, have you thought about what you're going to do with the house?" Charisse asked, leaning against the doorframe, trying to sound casual. This was it, the question he'd been waiting for. "I don't know," he said with a sigh, folding a worn-out sweatshirt. "It's a lot to deal with. The lawyer said probate can take months, maybe even a year." He invented a lawyer, another piece of misdirection. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Relief and a little bit of smugness. She thought she had bypassed the entire probate process. She thought the house was already hers. "Well, don't rush into anything," she said. "Just focus on getting your head straight. We can figure out the big stuff later." "Yeah, later," he agreed. He took Micah to the park, pushing him on the swings until his arms ached. He listened as his son chattered on about school, about a new cartoon, about the wobbly tooth in the front of his mouth. In Micah's innocent presence, the cold anger in Calvin's chest momentarily warmed. This was who he was fighting for. Not for a house, not for money, but for the simple, pure love of his child. A love his wife and mother-in-law had tried to leverage and discard. Later that week, he staged another scene. He called Charisse in a feigned panic. "I can't find Dad's old life insurance policy," he said, his voice laced with manufactured anxiety. "I know he had one, for the funeral expenses. I've looked everywhere." "Oh," she said, "don't worry about that. I found it last month when I was helping him organize his papers. I handled it. The funeral is all paid for." "You did?" he asked, injecting a note of pathetic gratitude. "Wow." "Charisse, thank you. I don't know what I would have done." "It's fine, Calvin," she said, her voice patronizing. "Someone had to be the adult." He hung up the phone, his hand clenched into a fist. She had found the policy. She had handled it. She had positioned herself as the responsible one, the executor in practice, all while she was forging his name and stealing his birthright. Every lie she told him, every act of condescension he recorded. He made notes after every call, dating and timing each conversation. He was no longer a husband. He was an investigator building a case against his own wife. The final act of his playing dumb phase was the most difficult. A week later, Charisse called him. "So, my mother and I were talking," she began, "and since you're staying at the Germantown house anyway, we were thinking it makes sense for you to start clearing it out." "Clearing it out?" "You know, packing up your father's things. The furniture, the clothes. A lot of it is just junk we can call one of those 1-800-GOT-JUNK places. We need to get it ready to sell." The audacity of the "we" was breathtaking. Calvin took a deep breath. "Sell?" he asked, his voice a perfect imitation of a broken, confused man. "Charisse, I can't think about that right now. That's my father's home. And it's a valuable asset we can't afford to just sit on," she snapped, her patience finally breaking. "This is what I'm talking about, Calvin. You're too emotional. This is a financial decision. That house is our best chance to finally get a down payment for a real home in a place like Chestnut Hill. It's what your father would have wanted, for Micah to have a better life." He let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell her he knew about the deed, about the forgery, about the notary. He wanted to tell her that his father had seen right through her and had protected him from beyond the grave. Instead, he said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm not thinking straight. I'll start packing things up." "Good," she said, her voice softening again, back in control. "That's all I'm asking." He hung up the phone. The performance was over. He had all the confirmation he needed. She believed she was in complete control. She had no idea what was coming. Calvin knew he couldn't fight this battle with his own grief-fueled anger. He needed a professional, someone who spoke the language of trusts and deeds and fraud. The name his father had used for the will, Morgan, Stern, and Associates, was his starting point. He looked them up. They were a high-end firm in one of the glass towers at Logan Square, the kind of place that cost a fortune just to walk into. He hesitated, looking at his own modest bank account, which held just over $6,000. Then he thought of Chariss's smug face, and he made the call. He was connected to a woman named Alana Morgan, one of the firm's senior partners. Her voice was warm, but no nonsense. When he explained who he was, James Hayes' son, she immediately cleared her schedule. "Your father was a very wise man, Mr. Hayes. Please come in tomorrow at 9 a.m. No charge for the initial consultation." The next morning, Calvin walked into an office that was the physical embodiment of power. Walnut panels, floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of the city, expensive modern art on the walls. Alana Morgan was a sharp, impeccably dressed black woman in her 50s, her hair in elegant silver locks. She wore an $8,700 Armani suit and exuded an aura of calm, unshakable competence. Calvin, in his best $250 suit that he'd bought for a wedding 5 years ago, felt out of place, but resolute. He sat across from her vast desk and laid out the story, his voice quiet and even. He told her about his father's death, about Charisse kicking him out, about the phone call from the Department of Records. He then placed the copy of the fraudulent quitclaim deed on her desk. Alana picked it up, her eyes scanning the document with an unnerving speed. She didn't say anything for a full minute. The silence in the room was absolute. "She filed this the day you were picking out his casket," Alana said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. "Yes?" Calvin replied. "And the notary is a Patricia Beale." She typed the name into her computer. Independent notary. Operates out of a small office in South Philly. A lot of these independent notaries, they get sloppy or greedy." She then pulled up another document on her screen and turned it toward him. It was his father's will. "Mr. Hayes, Calvin, your father came to see me 2 months before he passed. He was worried. He told me his daughter-in-law was circling like a vulture. His words, He said he was concerned she would try to pressure you or manipulate you regarding his property after he was gone. Calvin stared at the screen, a lump forming in his throat. His father had known. He had seen this coming and had taken steps to protect him. He wanted to ensure the house, the barber shop, and his savings, which amount to about $72,000 by the way, went directly and unimpeachably to you, Alana continued. So we didn't just write a will. We created an irrevocable trust. Think of it as a legal fortress. Once the assets are in the trust, they cannot be removed. The trust owns the property, and you are the sole trustee with full control. The will was just the instrument to pour his remaining assets into the trust upon his death. The trust itself has been the legal owner of that house for the last 10 weeks. She leaned forward. This quitclaim deed, she tapped the paper with her finger, is a work of fiction. It's a worthless piece of paper trying to claim ownership of a property your wife had no legal right to touch, signed with a forged signature, notarized under fraudulent pretenses. This isn't just a family dispute, Calvin. This is a felony. Several, in fact. Forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy, filing a false instrument. We have her. Cold. Calvin felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy. So what do we do? Alana's expression turned grimly satisfied. Her billing rate was $1,200 an hour, and Calvin was about to see why. We don't just invalidate the deed, we dismantle the entire scheme. First, we hire a private investigator. My guy is the best. He'll pay a visit to our notary, Patricia Beal. I suspect a little pressure will make her talk. Second, we get a certified statement from the clerk at the Department of Records who flagged this. Third, we subpoena your wife's and mother-in-law's phone records for the week of your father's death. I'd bet my law degree they were coordinating this entire thing. She laid out the strategy. It was a multi-pronged attack, precise and devastating. We will compile everything into a single binder, the trust documents, the fraudulent deed, the investigator's report on the notary, your sworn affidavit about the timeline, your phone records, their phone records. Then, we don't just file a civil suit. We take the entire package to the district attorney's office. We refer this for criminal prosecution. Calvin swallowed hard. Criminal? They tried to steal a house, Calvin, Alana said, her voice like steel. That's theft on a grand scale. The law takes that very, very seriously. My fee for this is a $5,000 retainer to begin. The total cost will likely be around $20,000, but we can ask the court to have your wife cover your legal fees when this is all over. Calvin didn't hesitate. He thought of Micah's drawing. He thought of Odette's sneering finally. He thought of Sherry's cold eyes. Let's do it, he said, pulling his worn leather wallet from his pocket. He would drain his savings account to pay for it. It was no longer about the money. It was about justice. It was about honoring the final protective act of his father. The strike was planned with the precision of a military operation. Alana Morgan orchestrated every detail. For 2 weeks, her team worked quietly, assembling the arsenal. The private investigator, a former Philly cop named Marcus, paid a visit to Patricia Beal, the notary. His report was chillingly concise. Ms. Beal, when presented with the evidence and the prospect of a felony charge and losing her license, confessed immediately. She admitted that Charisse and her mother, Odette, had come to her office on March 14th. They had paid her $500 in cash, 5 times the standard fee, to notarize the document without the signer present. Odette had done most of the talking, assuring her it was just a family matter, to simplify things for her grieving son-in-law. Patricia had signed and stamped the document knowing it was illegal. Her sworn, videotaped confession became Exhibit A in their binder. The binder itself was a masterpiece of legal warfare. It was 4 inches thick, meticulously organized with colored tabs. It contained the irrevocable trust, the fraudulent deed, Patricia Beale's confession, a statement from Darlene Fincher at the records department, Calvin's detailed timeline of his father's last days, cross-referenced with his own phone location data, and the subpoenaed phone records. The records showed a flurry of calls and texts between Charisse, Odette, and Patricia Beale on the day the deed was filed. It was an open and shut case. The strike was set for a Thursday morning at 10:30 a.m. Alana had coordinated 3 actions to happen simultaneously. Action 1. A process server, a large, impassive man named Gus, was dispatched to the downtown law firm where Charisse worked as a paralegal. He was instructed to serve her personally, in the office, with 2 documents, a civil complaint to quiet title and formally nullify the fraudulent deed, and Calvin's petition for divorce, citing financial fraud as grounds. Action 2. At the exact same moment, Marcus, the private investigator, would hand-deliver a copy of the entire evidence binder to the Economic Crimes Unit of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, along with a formal criminal complaint. Action 3. A certified letter from Alana's office would arrive at Calvin's old apartment, addressed to Odette. The letter would inform her that she was named as a co-conspirator in the criminal complaint, and that she should retain legal counsel immediately. Calvin spent that morning at his father's house, not in the dusty rooms upstairs, but in the old barber shop on the ground floor. He ran his hand over the cracked leather of one of the 2 antique barber chairs. He could almost hear the hum of the clippers, the sound of his father's laughter. He was not nervous. He was strangely, profoundly calm. He was simply a force of consequence. At 10:32 a.m., his phone rang. It was Alana. "Gus just served her," she said. "He said she went completely white." The scene, as Gus later described it to Alana, was pure corporate drama. Charisse was at her cubicle, surrounded by her colleagues. Gus walked up and said her name. "Charisse Hayes?" "Yes," she had answered, looking up, annoyed at the interruption. "You've been served," he said, placing the 2 thick envelopes on her desk. The words echoed in the suddenly silent office. Her co-workers stared. Her boss came out of his office. Charisse looked at the envelopes, her name and the firm of Morgan, Stern, and Associates printed on them. Her hands trembled as she picked up the divorce petition. Her eyes scanned the first page, the legal language stark and brutal. On the grounds of felonious financial fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. Her face, Gus had reported, crumpled. The mask of cool competence she wore at work dissolved into raw panic. She grabbed her $1,200 iPhone and practically ran to the women's restroom. Calvin could picture it perfectly. He could imagine her frantic thumbs as she tried to call her mother. Odette, at that moment, was likely staring at her own letter. The certified mail signature required would have been its own small ceremony of dread. She would be reading the words co-conspirator, felony charges, potential prison sentence. The life she had imagined for her daughter, the $590,000 house in Chestnut Hill funded by a stolen inheritance, was turning to smoke before her eyes. The first voicemail from Charisse hit Calvin's phone at 10:38 a.m. Her voice was a high-pitched, panicked whisper. "Calvin, what is this? What have you done? My boss is looking at me. Everyone is staring. A divorce? Financial fraud? Call me back right now. This is a mistake." He didn't answer. He just listened, his expression unreadable. The second voicemail came at 10:45 a.m., this time from Odette. Her voice was no longer smug and condescending. It was shrill, laced with fury. "Calvin Hayes, you listen to me. You call off your dogs right now. What is this letter? Conspiracy? Do you have any idea what you're doing? You are trying to ruin my daughter. You will regret this." He saved the voicemail. At 11:15 a.m., a third voicemail from Charisse. The anger was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading tone. "Calvin, please. Baby, please call me. We can talk about this. There's been a misunderstanding, a huge misunderstanding. I was just trying to help, to make things simpler for you. You were so overwhelmed with grief, I was just trying to take care of things. Please, you have to believe me." He listened to the lie, so bald-faced and pathetic, and felt nothing but a cold, empty space where his love for her used to be. She was still trying to manipulate him, still casting him as the fragile, emotional man who needed her to be the adult. The fourth voicemail at 11:30 a.m. was Charisse again. She was crying now. Hysterical sobs punctuated her words. They're calling me into HR. My boss, he saw the papers. He said I have to talk to them. Calvin, this is my job, my career. You can't do this to me. What about Micah? Have you thought about Micah? The mention of his son, her last-ditch effort at emotional blackmail, was the final confirmation. He deleted the voicemail without saving it. The strike was a success. The foundation of their deceit had been shattered. Now, all he had to do was stand back and watch it all fall down. The consequences cascaded with brutal, systematic efficiency. Alana Morgan had not just built a case, she had triggered an avalanche. For Charisse and Odette, there was no escape, only the crushing weight of their own choices. The first consequence was swift and professional. At 1 p.m. on the day she was served, Charisse was fired from her job. Her firm, a prestigious downtown law practice, could not tolerate a paralegal accused of felony forgery and real estate fraud. The charge struck at the very heart of her professional credibility. She was escorted from the building with her belongings in a cardboard box, losing her $62,000 a year salary, her health insurance, and any hope of a positive reference. Her career in the legal field was over before it had truly begun. The second consequence was criminal. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, presented with Alana's ironclad binder, formally opened an investigation within 48 hours. A detective from the Economic Crimes Unit contacted Charisse and Odette, informing them that they were persons of interest in a felony investigation. The casual cruelty they had shown Calvin was now replaced by the cold, impersonal machinery of the justice system. They were forced to hire a criminal defense attorney, a man who charged them a $15,000 retainer up front, money they had to borrow from Odette's dwindling savings. The third consequence fell upon the notary, Patricia Beal. The State Notary Commission, alerted by the DA's office, summarily revoked her license. She was also charged with a misdemeanor for her role, but agreed to testify against Charisse and Odette in exchange for probation. Her small business and the reputation she had spent years building were destroyed for a $500 cash payment. The fourth consequence was social. Odette had cultivated an image as a pious, respected elder at her church in West Oak Lane. The news of her involvement in a criminal scheme to defraud her own son-in-law, especially so soon after his father's death, spread like wildfire through the congregation. The whispers followed her down the aisles. The friends who used to invite her for Sunday dinner suddenly stopped calling. The pastor requested a private meeting, expressing his deep disappointment. Her social standing, the bedrock of her identity, crumbled into shame and isolation. The fifth consequence was financial, and it was devastating. The divorce proceedings were a formality. The judge, a stern woman who had reviewed the evidence from the criminal case, was openly contemptuous of Charisse's actions. In the settlement, Calvin was awarded full and sole ownership of all assets contained within his father's irrevocable trust, a fact that was already legally secure but was now affirmed by the court. Due to the egregious nature of the financial fraud, the judge awarded Calvin primary physical custody of Micah. Charisse was granted supervised visitation twice a month. Furthermore, the judge ordered Charisse to reimburse Calvin for his entire legal bill, which came to $22,450. She was also ordered to pay child support based on her previous salary, a ruling that left her gasping in the courtroom. Calvin watched it all unfold from a distance, his face a mask of neutrality. He never attended a hearing he wasn't required to. He communicated only through Alana. The stream of voicemails continued for a time, ranging from rage to tearful pleading to bitter accusations. But he never listened to them. He simply forwarded them to Alana's office to be logged as evidence of harassment. The final quiet consequence was the loss of the apartment. Unable to afford the $1,350 monthly rent on her own, and with no job prospects, Charisse and Odette were evicted 2 months later. Calvin had arranged through his lawyer for them to have access to the apartment to remove their belongings. He didn't go himself. He didn't want to see them. He didn't need to. The consequences were not his revenge. They were the invoice for their own greed, delivered by a world that for once balanced its books. He was free. And in the quiet of his father's house, with his son safe beside him, he could finally begin to build a new life, not on a foundation of lies, but on the solid ground of his own integrity. 1 year later, the scent of bay rum and fresh lavender filled the air at 5617 West Coulter Street. The rain of the past had given way to a warm, persistent sunlight that streamed through the large, clean front window of the newly reopened barber shop. Calvin had spent the last 9 months painstakingly restoring it, not just as a business, but as a memorial. He had kept his job as an HVAC technician, working his regular hours, but his evenings and weekends were devoted to this space. He had stripped the old linoleum flooring himself, revealing the original hardwood underneath, which he sanded and polished until it glowed. He had the 2 antique barber chairs, manufactured in the 1950s, reupholstered in a deep crimson leather at a cost of $1,800. He painted the walls a warm cream color and hung old, black and white photos of the neighborhood and of his father in his prime, a proud young black man with a set of clippers in his hand. The barber shop, which he named James & Son, was only open on Saturdays for now. He had hired one other barber, an older man named George, who had been a friend of his father's. Calvin himself had taken classes and gotten his barbering license. He found a surprising peace in the simple, focused work, the steady hum of the clippers, the precise line of a fade, the easy conversation with the men who sat in his chair. This Saturday was bright and busy. The shop was full of life. Men from the neighborhood, old and young, filled the chairs, their voices a low, comfortable hum of sports talk and local news. Calvin, wearing a crisp white barber's coat, was finishing a cut on a young boy. His deep brown skin was luminous in the afternoon light. In the corner, 7-year-old Micah was diligently sweeping with a small broom and dustpan Calvin had bought him for $10. His twists, now a little longer, bounced as he moved. He took his job very seriously, carefully brushing the small clippings of hair into a neat pile. He was home. On the wall behind the counter, next to the cash register, was a simple black frame. Inside it was a child's drawing on a piece of folded paper. It was the picture Micah had drawn for him, the little row house with the barber pole, and the 2 figures standing in the doorway. It was a daily reminder of what was real, of what he had fought for. It was his most valuable possession. He finished the boy's haircut, spinning the chair around to face the mirror. "There you go, little man, looking sharp." The boy's mother smiled, handing Calvin a $20 bill. "Thank you, Calvin. It looks wonderful. Your father would be so proud." "Thank you, Miss Eleanor," Calvin said, his voice warm. He felt a familiar pang of love for the man who had given him all of this, not just the building, but the legacy of community and honest work. After the last customer left and they had cleaned the shop, Calvin sat in one of the barber chairs, and Micah climbed into his lap. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden rays through the window. "Did I do a good job sweeping, Daddy?" Micah asked, his voice full of a child's unfiltered honesty. "You did the best job," Calvin said, hugging him tight. "You're my #1 guy." He looked around the quiet shop, at the legacy he was rebuilding piece by piece. He thought of Charisse and Odette. He had heard through the grapevine that they were living in a small apartment in a different state, struggling to make ends meet. He felt no anger, no satisfaction. He felt nothing at all. He had forgiven them, not for their sake, but for his own. Holding on to that bitterness would have been like letting them live rent-free in his soul. And his soul was no longer for rent. He realized now that true wealth had nothing to do with a $590,000 house in Chestnut Hill or a $900 handbag. It wasn't an asset you could acquire through trickery or deceit. True wealth was the feeling of his son's small body relaxed against his chest. It was the respect of his community. It was the quiet pride of continuing his father's work, of creating a space where people felt welcome and cared for. It was the freedom to be a good man on his own terms. We build our lives brick by brick with choices and actions. Some people try to take shortcuts, stealing bricks from others' foundations, but a house built on theft can never truly stand. In the end, the only thing that endures is what you build with your own 2 hands, with honesty and love. What do you believe is the foundation of a truly wealthy life? Let's talk about what really matters in the comments below. And if you found strength in Calvin's story, please subscribe to Love Beyond Pride for more stories of justice, legacy, resilience, and the quiet triumph of character.